Hey, it's that time of the month again, so turn it on and turn it up, and welcome to Texas World Language Radio. This is episode 4 now, and I'm your host, James Ayers, coming to you live from Frisco, Texas. Well, it's probably not live, but we're coming to you from Frisco, Texas, and wonderful co-host and our voice of reason, World Language Master Consultant from Region 10, Dr. Meredith Clark. Dr. Clark, how are you today?
Okay, how are you doing, James?
Good. It's summer, and so we kind of got this, we're working hard, but it's kind of that feeling of summer, and so that's nice.
Yes, summer is the busiest time at the ESC, so I feel like things are going to ramp up for me, but I know you just came out of curriculum writing with your team, so you're feeling pretty good having accomplished that, and it's only the first week of June, right?
It is, and so we've got a long ways to go, but I also feel like we got a short time to get there. So we're working hard, and it's a good time.
Good.
Our episode today is continuing off of what we've done here the first 3 episodes, and so if you haven't tuned in yet, this is all about the TEKS. And we started episode 1 by bringing in Greta Lundgaard, who worked on the TEKS back in 2012 through 2013. And we had a good discussion on how the TEKS were derived and how they came to the conclusion of what the TEKS were going to be. Episode 2 was talking about the overarching outcome of the TEKS, which is communication, which is defined there in the TEKS. And then last episode, we got into a great discussion on the proficiency levels that are defined in the TEKS. And so we've got this framework that we're building up now, and I think you can all see where this is heading. Now we're moving towards the actual student expectations and what we're wanting students to be able to do. And again, having all of this kind of come together really can inform what's going on in the classroom. And I think that's part of what we're going to get into today as well, is how these student expectations drive pretty much everything that we're doing in the classroom, from assessment to instruction, planning, you name it, and how they should drive some of that. And so let's get into it today. We're going to talk a little bit about student expectations, and specifically talk about student expectations when it comes into the interpersonal mode. So I've got my copy of the TEKS here. Meredith, you got yours ready?
You know, I don't leave home without it, James.
We've got the hard copy there. Mine are digital here. So
yeah.
Let's take a look. We got into talking about the TEKS with Greta, and episode 2, we really focused on not just how the TEKS were organized, but the overarching outcome. And so if you look at the TEKS there, they get into these general requirements, and then you get into this introduction that defines some of these things. And so we get into communication being the overarching outcome of what we're hoping students to accomplish. We talked about a good definition of that being the one that Bill Van Patten provided, with the interpretation, expression, and negotiation of meaning in a specific context with purpose. Mm-hmm. And the TEKS also go in and define per level what proficiency targets we're trying to hit. And what's cool about this, and Meredith, I've got to admit, I've never gone this deep into the TEKS, but I was in there the other day, and I'm always in levels 1, 2, and 3. But the TEKS are defined all the way through level 7.
They are.
You can get all the way into superior level when it comes to proficiency levels and even student expectations, kind of what those will look like through 7 years.
Yeah, that's pretty amazing. And so when we talk about successful world language programs provide long articulated sequences for student learning, I mean, we're set up on the pathway for proficiency. And I love our TEKS, that they're so amazing. I think that unfortunately, like, they get glossed over a lot in professional learning. And like, we think about, I want to go to the session that's going to give me some tricks or some tools for my classroom. But man, if we'll just dig in and actually take a close look at our TEKS, we're gonna see that we have all the information we need, pretty much all the information, I'd like to think, to really be successful and ensure that kids meet those desired results, which you just mentioned were the proficiency levels per course.
Yeah, absolutely. What I really like about the organization of the TEKS, and then let's jump into this today with the student expectations, is really how they're organized by the modes of communication. So know that communication is the overarching outcome. that makes sense, I think, to anybody. If you have a student that's taking a language class, as a parent, I want them to be able to communicate. That's
Yeah.
I like how then it gets into these proficiency targets, because now that's telling us how well they can communicate. And now we have these student expectations that are broken up into those modes of communication, starting with the interpersonal mode. And so we can actually look at each of those modes, which is what we'll do. We'll focus on interpersonal today, and then subsequent episodes we'll focus on interpretive and presentational. And now we can see exactly what it is that we're hoping students can do in each of these areas. So when it comes to them having a conversation, that's your interpersonal mode. We should be able to look at these student expectations now, as we will in a second, and determine, okay, are these things that we want our students to be able to do? And then now, with combining these with the proficiency levels, how well should they be able to do these things? So let's dive into it. I think that's the overarching message today, is that it's about what students can do with the language. It's they know here, even though we talk about TEKS being knowledge and skills, there's two parts to knowledge and skills. For language courses, it's really the skill part. It's what can they do with the language. So as we go through these student expectations, I'm impressed that all of them are about what a student can do with language. It's not about what they know. And I think that's a message we'll see recurring throughout the episode today as well.
Of course. Yeah. And then I think about, as a teacher, let's just go ahead and throw this question out there. What am I supposed to do with this information? Right. So yeah, I can look at the TEKS. I can read them. Y'all can talk to me for 45 minutes about the parts of the TEKS, but what am I supposed to do as a teacher? How does this help me deliver really great instruction? And I want to start with the very first part of T-tests, right, which is planning, right? And so we know that the student expectations are what students are supposed to do with the language, what kids can do in the language at the desired proficiency level. But from a teacher standpoint, we need the student expectations so much, because on our planning calendars, instead of putting vocabulary topics or grammar structures on the calendar, we've got to put the student expectations. Like you said previously, it's about student skill, right? And so, for example, if we look at 1.1a, level 1 interpersonal mode strand, student expectation A, it says, ask and respond to questions about everyday life in spoken and written conversation. So let's say that we're going to have a spoken conversation. And as a teacher, I've got to wrap my head around, okay, well, if I'm planning a unit and the unit is let's say it's the first introductory unit of level 1, and it's, getting to know each other and who am I, then the pitfall in planning, which nobody ever talks about, right? But we need to talk about, is that you look at that student expectation, which says ask and answer questions. Let's just say ask and answer questions about who you are using memorized words and phrases. And we go to our planning calendar and we think, oh, I'm going to teach personality vocabulary, physical descriptions vocabulary, and the verbs for to be and emotion verbs. And we go through the entire unit teaching the vocabulary and quizzing the kids on the vocabulary and quizzing them on uses of, the different forms of the be verbs that exist in all the languages. And we never get to the point where we're asking and answering questions like we would in a normal conversation, right? People never, when they're getting to know each other, they never talk about physical descriptions. I'm not going to say, hey, James, nice to meet you. I'm tall, right? That's absurd. So why are we teaching that, right? So that's the pitfall to avoid. But if we look at exactly what you said, what can the kids do with the language? And I say to myself, when I'm planning, I'm going to put the student expectation on the planning calendar. And then I'm going to ask myself, what does that conversation sound like in the language I'm teaching? In Korea, you would ask somebody how old they are very quickly, because you need to establish the hierarchy in age so you know which level of formality to use with them, right?
Yeah,
So,
I was sitting in, I walked in on a class during the school year, and I'd never seen this before, and I thought this was great. But they were doing just that. They were planning, and so they had their teaks, and they were talking about this. And this was a level 2 class, but it was ask and respond to questions. That was the teak that we're looking at. We're wanting kids to have conversations. So before they did anything else, they said, "Hey, we want to have kids ask and respond to questions about," I think it was their education. That was the theme of our unit. And so they said, "Hey, you and you have a conversation and let's see what it sounds like," before we did anything.
right. Yeah.
So and they did that, and they said, "Let's do this at a novice high, kind of intermediate low level." So they're doing this in English too. So they're trying to actually not act this out, but they're trying to see what would that be like.
It's activating prior knowledge, right?
It wasn't this driven by like, oh, let's pull out the vocab list and let's start hammering this out. It was like, let's see what that's going to look like first, to see if these are the words and phrases and structures that we believe are going to come up in this type of situation. Again, keeping in mind that this is a novice type of conversation. What would a novice do in this situation? What type of words and phrases would they use to ask questions or to respond to questions? What if they struggle? What would they use then? And so that was a really cool way to see how they were approaching that.
It is great. And, teachers need to be having that conversation, but it's also, just like you mentioned, great to have that conversation with students. This is a great activation of prior knowledge. You're activating prior knowledge about prior communication. So if we go into class and you say, "Hey kids, we're going to ask and answer questions to get to know each other. What questions would you need to ask?" Oh, now we're activating their brain and their prior knowledge. And I do this all the time with my English as a second language students. I don't make the questions. I say, "Hey, you're going to be in this situation, or we're going to communicate about this today. What questions would you need to ask?" And sometimes they generate questions that I would never have thought of. And it's because I don't live in their context, right? 15-year-old, 16-year-old kids might be, we may not know what kinds of questions they want to ask each other. They almost always want to ask each other, "What grade are you in?" Maybe not how old you are, but what grade are you in?
Yeah, and this isn't a knock on vocabulary lists or structures or anything like that. It's just, I think what you're saying here is now you're using the student expectation to drive that instead of what I feel like I'd done for years, which was the exact reverse. Like, okay, let's create this vocab list, and then what are we going to do with it?
Right. Yeah. Just check and see if the kids know the words, right? You just, it's like, I'm going to give them a vocabulary quiz, and it's like, oh, well, can they ask and answer questions about who they are? No. So we got to knowledge, but we never got to communication. Right.
Yeah, I know I shared this story with you, but I remember the first year coming in, and we had this unit on interests, and the book, you popped it open and they had this great page of showing kids doing all this stuff, and it was vocab. And I'd gotten this habit of, at the start of every unit, I'm just giving them vocab, and we're going to learn it, like a test at the end of the week or a quiz. And then we're going to try to do something with that, You'd have vocabulary that was like, I remember this one unit was on hobbies and interest, and they had the vocabulary for windsurfing.
That's so, oh my gosh. Yeah.
I thought, well, I don't know, but you got to know it for the test on Friday, right? And so
I know, right? It's
the
crazy.
exact opposite, where we were using vocabulary to drive our assessments and our instruction. And there was no communication happening at that point because we weren't focused on it.
Right. Yeah. And there weren't any interpersonal teaks. Right. And so if we think about asking and answering questions about who you are using memorized words and phrases, let's go back to level 1.1a. Kids can do that from the very first day in class. And if I put on my planning calendar, instead of greetings, I'm going to put 1.1a, ask and answer questions, on my planning calendar, then I'm going to completely change my approach. And after the end of day one, I can model, hola, soy, and then say my name. I'm giving an example in Spanish here, y tú, ¿cómo te llamas? And we can get to the, by modeling and rehearsing this in the target language, we can get to asking and answering questions in about 20 to 30 minutes in class, right? And it might only be a small chunk of the conversation, the total conversation, but that's exactly what we're going to plan to do. And so in my planning calendar, I'm going to repeat the student expectation several times so that by the end of the unit, we can, we learn how to ask and respond to different questions. So by the end of the unit, we can have a more robust conversation, asking and answering questions about who you are, right? So I think if that's like one takeaway that I would really stress here is that, you're not teaching vocabulary and grammar anymore. You're teaching kids to have a conversation, right? And that conversation includes an opener, a volley of questions, asking for clarification when you don't understand. And when we plan for that, it looks like putting those student expectations on our planning calendar.
Yeah, and I think that's a great way to look at it, Meredith. If you're looking at it from the standpoint of what is it that we want kids to do, and we say even in something as simple as we want them to have a conversation. Well, we have a student expectation that is directed specifically toward that, ask and respond to questions. And that's the skill, or that's a function that will continue on throughout their journey, right? And so one teacher, if I can tell parents and students and can communicate with them, hey, you're going to be able to have a conversation. Here's what it's going to look like. And you can kind of give them those descriptors for the novice, mid to novice. It's going to be a lot of words and phrases, maybe some sentences. It's going to be a lot of memorized language at this point. But then if you know where it's going after that, now you start to see this scale, or really this proficiency scale of how that's going to improve. Because that peak or that function doesn't go away. It's not like they mastered asking and responding to questions, especially in year one.
It goes all the way across. They're asking and answering questions all the way across, all the way up through the levels.
Yeah, and the only thing that's changing is the descriptor in the expectation of how well they're going to do that.
Right. And so I think we mentioned before in our previous episode, but also is probably a good time to remind teachers that the functions here are the verbs. So when we say language function, we're talking about a verb here, and each student expectation starts with a verb. Okay, but they change in text type and context, right? As we move across or up the proficiency scale, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's take a look at these student expectations, and let's just kind of roll through them. I mean, ask and respond to questions seems to be an anchor, right? If you want to call that a main standard or whatever, that's something obviously that in any interpersonal conversation, you're always going to ask and respond to questions. And so that's a mainstay there. But we have 5 other student expectations in levels 1, 2, and 3, and 4 add a 7th one in there. But let's kind of look at these and kind of go through these. As we do these, let's kind of go back and forth and discuss when these functions might appear just in everyday life, right? Because again, I think the goal is we want students to be able to communicate when it comes to having meaningful conversations, and we want them to be able to communicate on topics that are meaningful. I know you went to South Korea recently, and I'm sure what you were learning in Korean, you were hoping would be applicable and something that was meaningful and something that would allow you to participate in communication there. We don't want to learn windsurfing and some of these other topics that really aren't going to take us anywhere. And so as we kind of go through these student expectations, let's just kind of toss out what that looks like in different scenarios and different contexts.
Sounds great.
Looking in a classroom setting as well. So we had this first student expectation, which is to ask and respond to questions about everyday life in spoken and written conversation. So
that's student expectation A. Just wanted to throw that label out there.
Yep. And so I know we just kind of talked a little bit about this, but I'm going to pick your brain a little bit more on this one, because I tend to notice this word everyday life. And I think it's in there for a reason, especially for level 1, a level 1 course. What does that mean to you about everyday life?
So, this question comes up a lot when I work with teachers. They're gonna have questions about what's a familiar context. We see that on the part of the TEKS that really goes through those proficiency levels. And then when we switch into the student expectation, we're starting to see the term everyday life. And so I think that when we think of everyday life, we think of things that are very close to one's immediate reality, right? So anything that would happen daily, meaning, and I'm not talking about your routine, okay? Because a lot of times we don't even talk about our routines with people, but what I am talking about are contexts, meaning situations that are very familiar to people, meaning that anybody on the planet could talk about it, right? With ease. Talk about what you eat, your friends, what you do during the day. For some kids, that's school. For other kids, that's work. For some adults, it may be their everyday context would be different. So every day just means that it's something that you have knowledge of, that you see in your life every day.
Yeah, and that changes as we look at the TEKS across the different levels. So if you go to level 2 and 3, you'll start to see this beyond everyday life. And so that's important, because in some of these student expectations, you do get a few of these descriptor words that allude to the proficiency levels. Not, but some of them you do. So 1A, it's everyday life. I think that's important to understand. If you're looking at the student expectations, you might have some descriptors in there that are going to change as you move on to a level 2 and a level 3. The ask and respond, the function there, the verb, does not change.
Correct.
We always do when we have a conversation, no matter what level that is, even if we were at a distinguished or superior level.
Yeah, I mean, for example, professions and jobs, and I could see that there might be a context. I'm remembering when I studied abroad in Chile, and people would ask me about my family, and they would say, "Oh, and your dad, what does he do for a living?" Right? Or, "Oh, your mom, what does she do?" So it would make sense to talk about profession and kind of that introductory phase, but talking about what you want to be when you grow up, and learning about professions, writing a resume, preparing for an interview, those are not things that happen on a daily basis, right? Sure. And so I've even had conversations with people that are like, "I want my kids to write a resume in level 2," and I'm like, whoa, let's pull back just a second. Is that an everyday context? No, it's not. I don't write a resume every day. Nobody does, So I think that's kind of a good way to kind of monitor and see, are we asking and answering questions about things that people do on a daily basis? I eat lunch every day. I'm thinking about lunch right now, actually, right? So that's a level 1 or a level 2 topic, right? Now, where my lunch comes from and its impact on the environment, that's a level 3 or a level 4 topic context, right?
Absolutely. And so we have these student expectations. They always have a verb in there, which is your language function. Love that word, language function, and that's a word that's used throughout kind of the language learning community. You're going to see this in see this in rubrics, and you're going to see it all over the place. And I remember sitting in a class that you had a couple years ago, and you put it pretty simply that language function is what you do with language. It's that simple. There's nothing much more to it. And so these verbs, which are action verbs, obviously, or things that we're doing, that's really neat, because you can do a lot with language. And so if you sat down and thought about it, you can apologize, you could tell a joke, you can ask and respond to questions. There's so many things. We don't have all of those functions in our TEKS. We're not asking students to do all of those things. I don't have a TEK here that says tell a joke at the novice level, right?
Right.
That's not important, or that's not something that we might want to do at some point. But let me ask you this really quick before we jump into them. Why do you feel like we have the functions that we have in the TEKS? Because there's not a lot. There's only a few for each mode of communication.
Right. And I think this would be an interesting question for Greta. But last week, I was actually out in a district facilitating curriculum writing, and a teacher asked, are these in order of importance?
Oh, good question.
Excuse me, that's not what she said. She said, are these in order of difficulty? And I was like, whoa, I've been doing this for a while now. And that's the first time I've ever gotten this question. And then I actually stopped and I looked at the student expectations with a different lens. And I said, well, I'm not really sure if it's difficulty and complexity, although one might argue that articulating a request is more complex than asking and responding to questions. However, I would say that generally speaking, like you mentioned, student expectation A, ask and answer questions, that happens every time you have a conversation.
Maybe it's more by frequency of in there.
Yeah, so that was a really interesting question that got me to think about the TEKS in a different way. But if you think about ask and respond to questions, the next student expectation is B, express and exchange a personal opinion. You know, that happens pretty frequently, right? When we talk, some more for others. Right?
And I think it's important to denote also that, again, it's not that we're always just performing one function either, right? We might focus on working on one of these student expectations, maybe even one at a time. But sometimes we, when you're expressing and exchanging personal opinions, oftentimes that's in the context of a conversation where you are asking questions. I said, hey, did you see that movie the other day? And now all of a sudden we're talking about our opinions. Oh, I didn't like it because X, Y, Z. We're still responding to questions, but we've also thrown in another function that we're able to do there where we're critiquing something, we're expressing an opinion, we're supporting something there.
Right. Yeah. So very naturally fits in with A and B kind of go hand in hand a lot of times.
I think so. And so we've got ask and respond to questions. Let's just kind of roll through these.
Okay.
The functions here: asking and responding to questions. B is expressing and exchanging personal opinions or preferences. 1C is now you're asking and telling others what they need to, what they should, what they must do in spoken and written conversation. So already, just I think your point there of frequency, that's not something we do all the time. It's not an important function, but again, at least I hope I'm not telling people what they need to do or must do all the time.
Yeah. And like I was, taught commands as a part of my Spanish 2 or 3, whenever I took it in high school. And it was awful because here I go, studying abroad, and I say, pass the bread using a command, and informal at that. And folks just looked at me like, oh my goodness, like she's very bossy, right? Because I was never taught how to articulate requests, ask or tell others what to do in like a real life context. We were taught commands because that was in the textbook. And so my teacher at the time had to find kind of like a forced, and not a good context, right? I don't know. This student expectation is tricky.
Yeah, but I think if you look at that, that's a classic example of how vocabulary drove what you were trying to do. Whereas if we would flip that around, and I don't know what your teacher was like or your professor or whatever, but if they would have said, and maybe this was in preparation of you going to live in Chile or in another country, and if they would have known that, right, and had some context there and said, okay, look, our student expectation is to ask somebody a question or to tell somebody what they need to or should do. Well, when's that going to happen? Because now you're starting to think of what are the situations where this happens.
Yeah.
Now that allows you to bring in vocabulary that maybe is more appropriate to the situation or more appropriate to the context that you're going to be in at some point. And just saying, hey, let's learn some commands, go. These commands are going to work everywhere. Because sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah.
we got that one. Asking, telling others what they need to, should, or must do. Then we've got 1D, which is articulating requests, offering alternatives, or developing simple plans in spoken and written conversation. And then we have these two student expectations, E and F, that I kind of call these the qualifiers because they apply to almost everything. These aren't necessarily, they're these very generic language functions. So participate in a conversation, that's very generic, but it's telling us kind of the parameters here. Like we need to be able to do this in a culturally appropriate way, using the expressions, registers, and gestures that are appropriate. So I think, and there's one for the spoken conversation, one for the written conversation. E has to do with spoken conversation, F written conversation.
So I like to think of these as transparency SEs because they really overlap all the other SEs in interpersonal. So whether we're having an oral conversation or we're having a written conversation where we're texting somebody, we should always do that with culturally appropriate expressions, register, and gestures, right? So if you're doing student expectation A in class, you should also be, and it's a spoken conversation, you should also be doing student expectation E, right? So these aren't really, I see these E and F, they're not really student expectations that would be put on the calendar in isolation, right?
Let's do this for a second, because I know you teach an English class. I know you have students that are all over the map when it comes to proficiency there. So let's think of introductory English speakers for a second.
Okay.
What's something that you typically will work with them on as far as a topic or theme or point of discussion when it comes to learning language? What are things that they're interested in learning about, or things that you come out and say, I think these are important things that you should know about when it comes to learning English?
So do you mean like a context? Like,
yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so I just ask them what they want to learn about, because I mean they're in a pretty unique situation. And I am going to talk about my adult learners for just a second. I'm going to talk about some interesting surveys that we did with student learners in just a second. But most of them want to learn really transactional language that is everyday life. Right? I don't have to figure out what's everyday life. They tell me what they want to talk about in their everyday lives. So that's normally, I want to learn how to talk to my neighbor. And it's like, okay, about what? And it's like small talk, chit chat, right? So it's like, okay, we're going to talk about the weather. We're going to talk about maybe the plants in their yard, or, how's your family, right? Things that they can talk about with their neighbors. Transportation, ordering in a restaurant. All of these there are things that they are particularly asking for my novice to intermediate students. Now, my advanced students, I ask them, hey, what do y'all want to learn to communicate about? And they're like, we want to learn about scholarships for our kids because they're getting ready to go to college and we need to educate ourselves. They want to learn about science. They want to learn about history. Woo, the history unit was deep, y'all, with my advanced speakers. But so you can obviously see that students who are still in the novice and intermediate stages, okay, proficiency levels, they are still requesting to learn how to communicate about those everyday topics. And how I differentiate my instruction is we're talking about this everyday context, and but my novices are giving it to me with memorized words and phrases and some simple sentences. And I'm really pushing my intermediates to give me sustained simple sentences with details and simple elaboration. And so that's how I'm able to differentiate the instruction there. Now, what does this have to do with kids? You're like, okay, Dr. Clark, whatever. You teach adults. This is not the scenario we're working with here, right? We're K-12 educators. We have 200 ninth graders in our class. What are we going to do? And I will say that when I was working in Dallas ISD and also my first year in Region 10, we had tried to plan curriculum based more on student interests and what they wanted to communicate about. And so we gave kids a Google Form survey that had all of the 6 AP themes. and it had all of the sub themes listed underneath, and we had the kids just check off what are you interested, what interests you the most. And it was really, really eye-opening to see what contexts kids wanted to talk about in the north side of Dallas ISD versus the south, and in between districts, like even 2 districts right next to each other in the Metroplex. The kids were interested in topics that were totally different in terms of those sub-themes. So, you know, I would say that student interest really should drive a lot of the context, as much as teachers can, you know, use that to their advantage. And when you can, it's a lot easier to ask them to do the student expectations, because they're already interested and they already have the desire to communicate about those things.
Yeah, I'm glad that you said that. One of the things that I hear a lot from teachers is that, oh, you know, the kids don't care about this, or we're doing something in class that is not meaningful, or maybe they don't see it as quite as purposeful.
Mm-hmm.
You gave a lot of examples of things you work with your students, and a lot of those could probably even translate into the classroom. One of the things I really like about the way this was set up, and I know Greta talked briefly about this, the teams are set up to allow for us to define the different themes and topics and contexts that we're looking to use in the classroom.
Yeah.
And so if you do have students, you know, I know you've told me about the survey that you guys did with students, and kind of the topics and things that you're seeing them as far as what was meaningful. What a great idea, because if you're taking those things and starting to add those into your curriculum, we already have the objectives here. We already have these expectations. And so as simple as pairing those up, if you have students that want to learn about being able to do some of these transactional things, you know, if they're going on a trip or something, and that's something that's meaningful to them, or you have, you know, your students that are learning language and they want to talk to their neighbor. Well, asking and responding to questions with your neighbor, that's going to look different than asking and responding to questions in a different context. And so you can see by the way we define that, now that's going to drive everything else we do. You know, when you're working with your students on having conversations with their neighbors, the types of vocabulary, the types of questions they're going to ask, the setting, you know, even down to E there, where it's having spoken conversations using culturally appropriate expressions. Those conversations are going to be so much more informal than, you know, having a conversation with somebody at, you know, you're a job or an office, or you're at a hospital and you're having to have a conversation with somebody there.
Right.
And so these student expectations in the context are going to drive what we're doing here. They're going to drive the vocabulary that we're going to use, the structures that we're going to use. And so you get away from this, okay, level 1 is all about the present tense, and level 2 is all about the preterite imperfect for Spanish. And then level 3, we give them all the tenses.
Yeah.
That framework wasn't very functionable, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no. And I mean, you know, we mix the tenses a lot sooner. I mean, I know that, you know, if we read the actual performance descriptors, it's going to say that students in the intermediate really dominate the present tense. That is true, right? But you know, when I'm learning Korean, one of the first, you know, I would see my teacher once a week, and, you know, one very natural kind of open the class question, was classes one-on-one, but was, what did you do this week? And so, you know, here I am, a novice mid in Korean, but I learned the preterite very quickly with simple verbs, and I'm answering in a phrase like, I rode my horse, right? But, you know, I went to work. I checked my email, right? So like this kind of idea that these topics have to be separated doesn't necessarily make sense. And if we look at our student expectations, we'll see that they open the opportunity for not only for us to talk about what we want to talk about, but also how we want to talk about it, right? And also, what a lovely idea, like polling students about what they're interested in, like in the spring, so we can do our curriculum writing in the summer instead of like, I think they want to talk about this, or I think they should talk about this. And then we get through the entire year and we're like, oh, they hated the technology unit. And it's like, oh, and so like, I don't know, it's just a really neat idea about how we can use context with these student expectations. One that in particular, I think that also is very complicated, I get a lot of questions about, is expectation D, which is articulate requests and offer alternatives. And it's like, what does that even mean? What's a request? What's an alternative? And so it sounds like, hey, James, do you want to go play soccer with me this weekend? That's a request, right? It's an invitation. Now, if you can't, or like, what would the follow-up question be? Let's just play along here for a second. Hey, James, you want to go play soccer with me this weekend?
What time?
How about 6:30 in the morning?
Oh gosh, I can't make it that early. It'd have to be after 10 a.m.
Okay. All right. So number one, he's right. So he's responded to my request or invitation. Now, offering an alternative means he's going to suggest another time. So go ahead, James, offer me an alternative there.
Well, I'm not up for getting up at 6:30 a.m. So what about if we meet sometime after 10 or 11?
10 or 11 on Saturday or Sunday?
Let's stick with Saturday.
Okay. Saturday at 10 a.m. At the park near my house, near White Rock Lake. Is that cool?
Well, I live in McKinney, so that's way far. We're gonna have to negotiate some more here, Meredith. But yeah,
okay, right. You get it. So right, like I think like giving some scenarios, to help people kind of see these student expectations come to life are really important and help us see that final conversation and help us understand what kinds of chunks of language we need to teach. So there we needed to teach how to make an invitation or offer a request. James had to decline it. Then he had to offer an alternative. And then we had to come to an agreement, and I had to express agreement with him, right? And so we can really dig in and see, whoa, that's actually a lot to teach. Right.
Exactly. And we didn't even get to the part where, like, even just our conversation right there, even though it was made up and it was spontaneous and it was on the fly there, it was not, that was even way past a novice, mid to novice high level. Like to expect that our students would even have that conversation like we had it, right? And you can even get into, TE there where it's talking about culturally appropriate expressions and register and gestures, like, when you said 6:30, I laughed, right? Because I recognized immediately, like, I'm not getting up that early. Like, there's parts of the conversation that, that's not a novice conversation. If we were doing this for a level 1 class, we would have even scaled it back even more. What are the basic questions that are going to be asked? What's a basic novice level response? Why? It's early. And then offering an alternative. It's not going to be like, oh, let me think. It's just a simple alternative.
It's going to be 7. It's going to be 10 o'clock.
Mm-hmm.
That's the alternative, right?
Yep. So
it's like, you want to play soccer? When? Saturday. What time? 6:30.
So we've got some variables that are all coming into play now. Now we've had some good discussion the last few episodes now on the purpose of the TEKS is communication. Great. Mm-hmm. But taking these proficiency levels and understanding the different levels that our targets are for our students, now having these functions, these student expectations, again, combining those two is going to give us a pretty clear picture of what it is we want our students to be able to do and how well we want them to be able to do that, so that we can have these conversations of, all right, we have this unit on education. So let's have a conversation about education. What would that look like at a novice mid or novice high level? All right, now let's pull out the questions and answers that are going to fit for that type of conversation.
Right. So what does ask and respond to questions about education sound like at a level 1?
Versus a level 4, very different.
Yeah.
Somebody that's at that intermediate mid to intermediate high level, very different than somebody that's in a novice mid to novice high. What they're able to do from a functionality, even though the function's the exact same, ask and respond to questions.
Yeah. But the context changes a little bit and that text type changes.
Well, cool. Well, let's get into a few questions here to consider when we're looking at the student expectations. So we've gone through the different six expectations. You addressed this a little bit earlier, but I want to come back to this for a second. We run into this quite a bit too when we're planning, when we're either planning kind of our lessons, or really when we're doing curriculum planning and we're trying to put in clear objective for each unit. So we have these six student expectations. Are we expecting students to go through all 6 of these all the time, or at some type of frequency throughout the year?
Yeah, this is a great question. It's also a question that comes up a lot when I'm working with groups. And I always say, at some point during the year, you need to have, students need to be able to perform all of the student expectations. But in some units of study, it does not make sense to be asking and telling others what to do, right? So my answer is they don't have to be taught every single student expectation, every single unit. But when it does make sense and is natural for a conversation, written or oral, bring it up, right? So if we're talking about, what do you do for fun? It really makes sense to do student expectation B, which is express and exchange a personal opinion, A, ask and answer questions, and also D, right? So if we agree and we both have something that we like to do in common, it makes a lot of sense. Like, oh, hey, you like esports? Okay, Monday at 7:00, there's a tournament. Want to watch it with me, right? So, but we don't want to force that. For example, the expectation C, asking and telling others what they need to do. We see this a lot in the food unit, right? Where we're telling people recipes and cut the carrots and chop the vegetables. It makes absolutely no sense to do that. If you look at a cookbook, if you listen to how people narrate, right, how to cook something, at least in Spanish, they don't use commands at all. So we never want to force use a student expectation function when it doesn't make sense.
Yeah, I love how these are separated into the modes of communication. I think that if you look at it from that standpoint, we're working on interpersonal communication. That we want to balance that out, I think, more so than looking at these student expectations and saying, now let's balance out all 6 of these. So I'm going to teach 1A the first semester, the first 6 weeks, and 1B the second 6 weeks. That doesn't seem to make a lot of sense.
Right.
We're always mindful of these modes of communication, and we're always moving through the interpersonal, interpretive, and presentational throughout. But I like what you said, finding what makes sense there for whatever the theme or the topic is and the context. And then what would that work best? And I think that's why we talked about this. That's why we see 1A so much. We ask and respond to questions because that's what you do in a conversation.
Yep, it's going to be happening.
The context, really, it's always there.
Right. It is always there, 100%. So James, let's transition here to assessment for just a second. Okay. How do these student expectations connect to our assessment practices?
Well, it's a great question. I remember a couple years ago, we came into one of your workshops with some administrators, and we talked a lot about if you're going into classrooms, what are you seeing? And I'd always gone through walkthroughs when I was a teacher and gone through with our coordinator, and we were looking for specific practices, strategies, our kids and teachers using the target language. But in this workshop, you talked a lot to the administrators about, let's just look for the student expectations. Let's start there. Not that the target language isn't important, or not that these strategies aren't important, but before we do any of that, can we identify what is actually trying to happen in the class? And so, if we're able to walk into a classroom and I walk in and you're teaching your English language learners and you're working on asking and responding to questions about, typical everyday life scenarios, like with a neighbor, and I should be able to see that happening, right? I should be able to see, the students practicing asking questions and there being some communication happening, whatever's going on. And so the student expectations really drive this whole process of backwards design. So everything from our outcomes to our assessments to our instruction. And if we look at it in that order, it becomes pretty clear. If we take that student expectation, ask and respond to questions, know what a novice mid and a novice high, what that looks like at that. They're using memorized words and phrases, maybe some sentences in this conversation. Then now we can really start to plan backwards. Okay, so if we know what that looks like, we have the descriptors for an assessment. Create an assessment just using that student expectation. I mean, the assessment is ask and respond to questions about whatever your topic is.
Yeah, and it turns into a prompt.
Exactly, and it's not, I need to see these words used, or it's not, I need you to write 5 sentences, because your descriptors are there with your proficiency descriptors, right? You're going to get your text type as your memorized words and phrases. You're going to get your descriptor for vocabulary in there. You know, students can use an amount of vocabulary.
Borrowed words, cognates, all of that.
And so that's going to create our assessment. You know, I want to see somebody have a conversation, and I want to see what that looks like. And if they go in one direction with the conversation about the weather versus the other direction, that's okay. It's still about the weather, and they're still asking and responding to questions. So if I'm seeing them do that at this novice mid to novice high level, then that's appropriate for the level 1 class. And so all of our assessments should be exactly related to these student expectations.
So the practice is, right, just like at the beginning, we said, okay, on your instructional calendar, put the student expectation the kids are going to be doing, ask and answer questions. Don't put, sports vocabulary on your calendar, right? Put the student expectation on the instructional calendar. Similarly, on the assessment, the student expectation is the assessment, right? So you don't have to create, you meaning teachers out there, everyone who's listening or watching, you don't have to create a multiple choice fill in the blank test that tests discrete knowledge. You just have to create an interpersonal speaking or writing prompt. And then the kids have to go do the conversation and record it. And think about the moving the needle on student language proficiency, right? If we change our assessment practice and actually start assessing kids directly by giving them a student expectation aligned prompt, how is those outcomes are going to be different from, people who are still taking a pen and paper test, right?
Absolutely.
So really cool. It's really cool.
Well, and you said it right there too. Whatever we're going to assess is what we're going to do in the class. So it's, again, this backwards design process that if we have specific outcomes that we're going towards, that's going to determine what our assessments are, because we want to see evidence that students are getting to those outcomes. And then our instruction is going to follow suit. So, going back 17 years, in my Spanish 1 classroom, we gave vocabulary tests every week.
Me too.
But the instruction was like, it was learning vocabulary. It was games to learn vocabulary, or we did grammar, right? And so we learned about ser and estar in the Spanish class. And I remember one year giving a quiz every day, wanting kids to get all the tenses down between ser and estar. And so in class, that's what we did, because that was my goal for them, is to have them be able to distinguish between ser and estar. Right.
It wasn't for them to ask and answer questions about everyday topics, right? So, that's why people always say, hey, I took, X amount of years of whatever, and I can't speak a word. And, people always feel bad. They feel like they're the failure.
Sure.
I spent 2 years in whatever the name of the language was, and I can't communicate. And I always want to reach out and hug that person and say, it's not your fault. You weren't being taught to communicate ever from the get-go. So our monolingualism isn't because we're not smart. It's because we haven't been teaching for communication,
And I want to throw in, and I feel like we get into this situation where we go, vocabulary is bad or grammar is bad. It's not that they're bad. It's that our focus is not that. Our focus is these functions that we want students to be able to perform. Now, you have to understand that vocabulary and grammar play a part in that.
Oh, yeah.
But that's where the planning comes in. If you know that we're going to ask and respond to questions about your neighbor, the example that you used, then you do have to go and you have to figure out what is the vocabulary and the grammar that's appropriate for that. And that comes back down into there too. And so again, when I say that we gave vocabulary quizzes and grammar quizzes, okay, vocab and grammar is a big part, but the target was not there. And so that's all we focused on. If your target is the language function, then you're going to bring in the vocabulary that is appropriate, and you will use that in your class, and you will help students work through that at these levels. And so don't think that you're just going to go in and say, we're going to have a conversation go. That's still a big part. You got to have the vocabulary and the structures that are appropriate for that too.
But unless the teacher can
do, then you're not going to be able to identify those.
It's like if like, and I'll for if people are watching the video, it's like if you're only doing vocabulary and grammar, you're going to get to knowledge. But if you never ask kids to, do the student expectations, which is the skill part, then, they're going to learn a lot of stuff. They can learn a lot of stuff, right? But then they can't communicate. They can't go the extra mile and actually do the skills. And that's really, really important. And so, like you said, we're not vilifying grammar and vocabulary. I had a teacher come up after a workshop and she's like, you said not to teach grammar and vocabulary. And I'm like, whoa, I never said that. I did say we're supposed to get kids to do this.
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
So I think the quick check here before we jump into a recap is kind of good rule of thumb is if you're teaching a class, ask yourself, what is it that I'm trying to get my students to be able to do? And think about it. And if you don't know any of the TEKS at this point, just ask yourself, what is my outcome here? What am I hoping that my students can do either by the end of this class or by the end of the week or by the end of the month, however you want to look at it? Because if you can sit down in your class on a Monday morning, you've got all your plans made from the previous weekend, and you sit down and you say, what do I want my students to be able to do? And if your answer is, I want my students to be able to know these vocabulary words, well, that's not really doing anything. That's knowledge, right? So there has to be something in there you want them to do, and it needs to be communicative in nature.
Right.
That's where our TEKS are at. Okay, so if you're struggling with that, again, pull out the TEKS. You're going to be able to find a TEK that's communicative in nature. That has a function that you can work on with your students.
And if we just follow the TEKS and get kids to do the TEKS, especially those student expectations, they're going to learn how to communicate. And the TEKS have already done the heavy lifting for us. We just need to do the TEKS and get kids to do the TEKS. Don't know how many times we can repeat it. It's all right here. It's all been planned masterfully for us. We just need to love our TEKS and let them do the work.
I like it. So quick recap. I know we hammered on this in the beginning. It's not about what you know when it comes to language. And when I say it's not about what you know, it's not about this explicit knowledge of vocabulary and grammar and what we can tell about the language. It's about what we can do with the language when it comes to communication. That's it. I think that's what I know that's what Greta would say was the direction that they were trying to head when they came up with the TEKS. And that's clearly what they say.
Right. And they picked these functions, just to go back to the question, is like, why only these, 5 or 6 functions? They're the most used functions that are going to allow people to, excuse the redundancy, function well when they communicate, right? And so Greta, mentioned as her legacy, she said she was really proud of getting these TEKS passed. And man, I mean, we couldn't be luckier. These things are amazing. And we should all be very grateful for our TEKS.
Agreed.
Yeah.
So let's keep on this here. So we've got 2 more modes of communication. We have the interpretive mode and the presentation mode. Just for some context, if you're not super familiar with the TEKS, You can get online, you can go to Google and just type in TEKS foreign language, and up will pop up the Texas Administrative Code, where you can find links to all the courses, levels 1 through 7, even though I don't think anybody's got a level 7 class. But for dual immersion purposes, and if you're looking at programs from like a K through 12 standpoint, it gives you an idea of how we progress through language as far as proficiency levels. But I challenge you to kind of take a look at those and see how these functions, they're consistent across these levels. You're going to see ask and respond to questions in levels 1, 2, 3, and 4. The descriptors might change a little bit. That everyday life will change to beyond everyday life. But go in there and take a look at that. You'll also notice that there's not a lot of TEKS. Math classes have 40 plus TEKS throughout the course. Again, these are knowledge kind of based content areas. So in math, you have a TEK for knowing the formula for circumference of a circle, you know, and then you have a TEK for the ability, the skill to be able to calculate that. Whereas for world languages, we only have 12 TEKS for levels 1, 2, and 3. We get 13 TEKS, and then we stay there for 4. So there's not a lot expectation because we're continuing these functions throughout. They're continuing to move on.
So yeah, and so it's really great, you know, that we can really spiral. We can really see how students build on these skills as they go through the proficiency levels. And also, like, when students understand like what that looks like at level 3 and 4, and that if they just stay in for 2 more years, you're going to be able to do this, then they'll know where they're going. It's been clearly defined for them, and they're more eager to stay in there and get there with us. So it's also, our student expectations are really great because of that as well. But as we wrap it up, you know, James, what's, you know, one practice, like you would, you know, if you were an educator who just listened to this podcast, what's one thing that you would want to stop doing, and what's one thing you would start doing?
One thing I'm going to start with the starting first of all, because I think start something that might allow you to notice something you might need to stop. But what I would start doing is exactly kind of what we talked about before. Just ask yourself, what is it that you want students to be able to do for a particular class, or for a particular unit, or for a particular time period? What is your outcome that you're wanting them to do?
And it's communicate. Right? Like, the students really want to communicate. The teacher really wants their kids to communicate. And so does the state of Texas. We're all in alignment.
Exactly right. And so if the answer to that is something other than something that points towards communication, then that's where you stop. Right. And so if I want my students to know all the tenses of French or Spanish, stop. Okay. That's not what we need to know in order to communicate right now. Those might play a part in the communication, but ask yourself that, and then see if you're lined up with any of these student expectations. Because if you are wanting them, and you might have something as simple as, I just want my students to be able to have a conversation. Okay, that's communication there. And guess what? We have some student expectations that point exactly towards that. And so now you're able to have that outcome and pull everything in that surrounds that, your assessments, you know, down to your vocabulary and your structures that you're going to teach, and your strategies too. Good.
I would say, like, if you are planning on your calendar with vocabulary groups, classifications, and grammar topics, I would say, please stop. And put on your planning calendar, okay, week 1, we're going to be focused on, in terms of, let's just talk about interpersonal, you know, we're going to be asking and answering questions. You know, week 2, we're going to be asking and answering questions, but different types of questions. Maybe week 3, we're going to be working on expressing and exchanging an opinion, right? We repeat that week 4 and we build. And then by the end of the unit, because I've planned on my calendar my student expectations, not vocabulary classifications or grammar classifications, right? Then we're going to be able to lead to that outcome that you just talked about, right? So planning on your calendar is a super important first task in order to get you there. So what's coming up next time?
Well, let's stick with the student expectations. Let's jump into the interpretive mode, which is not a lot of expectations there, but the interpretive mode is I love it because there's a lot of comprehension strategies. There's a lot behind it that I think we can get into to help you understand what is actually going through the brains of some of our students in a level 1, 2, 3, or 4 class, right? We can talk a little bit about, keyword recognition and maybe some of these top-down and bottom-up processes that are happening with students, and how the TEKS really align with how we comprehend things from a novice level up through an advanced level. So we'll work on interpretive next time, and then we'll get into the presentational in episode number 6.
Okay. Sounds great. So everybody out there, thanks for tuning in, and we will see you next time. Remember, what you're learning will help move the needle on student language proficiency. So let's get it done, folks.
Yeah.
Bye.